Namaskar. Hello. Greetings from Clinical Development Services Agency, an extramural unit of Translational Health Science and Technology Institute, Department of Biotechnology, Ministry of Science and Technology, Government of India. Welcome to NI ICMR WHO online course for ethics committees in India. We will study about monitoring ongoing research by ethics committees. The objectives of this study will be first to understand the need to monitor an ongoing research, and when we understand the need, we will learn the process of how to monitor and manage the findings. First, let us begin by understanding what is monitoring. Monitoring is a simple act of overseeing to ensure compliance. In the recent 2017 ICMR guideline, which is the National Ethical Guidelines for Biomedical and Health Research involving human participants, they have mentioned in page 45, 4.12.1 that there should be a mechanism which should be followed to monitor the approved study site until completion of the research, to check for compliance as well as to improve the function. If you see the Indian GCP 2001, page 24, 2.4.2, it mentions that the ethics committees are entrusted not only with the initial review. All the ethics committees actually first or usually reviews the proposal, and once approved, the study is conducted by the PI and the study team. But the Indian GCP, as I mentioned, that the ethics committees are entrusted not only with the initial review of the proposed research protocol, which is prior to initiation of the study projects, but they also have an immense responsibility, which is a continuing responsibility of regular monitoring. Please understand regular monitoring. For what? For compliance of the ethics committee to all the approved programs. This should be done till the completion of the project. Such an ongoing review should be done in compliance with the Declaration of Helsinki and all national and international guidelines for biomedical research. To understand monitoring, let us understand the overview. It is good to understand through two different perspectives, which are off-site, also sometimes referred as passive, and on-site, referred as active. Off-site is usually continuing review, an ongoing review, which happens regularly. This involves annual reports, periodic reports. We will come to all of them in our subsequent slides. Then comes the on-site, that is active monitoring. This happens for the routine, the regular monitoring, and it is usually nowadays risk-based. For all the monitoring, a prior necessary permission, approval or consent are required from various stakeholders of the study. There is something called for-cause monitoring. For-cause is for a particular legitimate reason, for specific reason. There will be some justifications. We will come to that in our subsequent slides. Let us try and understand monitoring through a very simple way, which is called 5W and 1H. 5 W's are why, when, where, who, what and how. Let us begin with why. Why do we need to monitor? We need to monitor because we always assume and we do not ensure. So, the first purpose is to ensure and not assume that once approved a study by the ethics committee, the study is exactly conducted as per the committed ethical standards. Second is very important because it forms one of the two goals or objectives of good clinical practice. Is by monitoring, you give an public an assurance that the right, safety and well-being of all the study participants are well protected. By doing so, first and second, you actually come through many lesson learned and continual improvement points that helps you to enhance the quality of ethical practice and thereby develop a quality culture. Now the question comes, when? In always or resource limited settings, it is advisable to have it at least once in a year. This is the least you can do. You can do also more often if deemed necessary. It depends upon the level of risk. High risk, more monitoring. Medium risk, regular or medium monitoring. It also depends upon resources available, especially financial. So, resource, risk and resource, of which risk is first, resource is second. It can also happen more if there are some specific reasons. Specific reasons can be complaints, public grievances. All this should be specified in the ethics committee SOP and also indicated in the approval letter. Now comes the question, where do you go to monitor? If it is a passive monitoring and off-site monitoring, then you can monitor at the EC Secretariat. It's a part of continuing an ongoing review and you can do it as per your SOP. If it is an active monitoring, which is an on-site monitoring, then you should go to the site, the study site. This can be routine, this can be risk-based. We'll come to both this. You will see the documents, you will interview the people, you will do random visits, you will review all the ICF documents, and also you will have chances to interview with the research participants. As mentioned earlier, for all this you require prior consent and approval from various stakeholders like investigators, study team members and sponsor. For 4CAUS you do not require, because 4CAUS calls for a different set of exercise. Now let us understand who will monitor. It is very important to know who will monitor, because ethics committee is a multi-sectorial and multidisciplinary team which comprises of 50% of the institutional members and 50% are non-institutional members. So, the monitoring team has to be decided by the ethics committee. For this, let us understand who is a monitor. In this context, a monitor is a person who is appointed by the ethics committee and empowered to monitor and report all the ongoing research and verify everything and present to the committee. The monitor can be a member of ethics committee. It can be a single person. It can also be a team. It is good to have a team comprising of scientific and non-scientific members. It is appreciable if a lay person becomes a part of the monitoring team. The chairperson can also monitor if situation arises. For example, some situations where the human protection is seriously compromised. For SAE monitoring, it is advisable to have an SAE committee or a subcommittee of ethics committee. There can be sometimes an independent body set up by the sponsor to monitor the conduct of a trial or a research. This can be like a TSMP. But before we decide who is monitoring or who is the monitor, it is extremely important that we address few issues. So, prior to any visit or prior to monitoring, one should address the issue of confidentiality and conflict of interest by the monitor when they go for monitoring. This, when cannot be eliminated, must be managed and must be declared and documented. Training is extremely important. Ethics committee members are trained in ethics. Monitoring is a skill-based job. So, the person has to be additionally trained and empowered to conduct monitoring. This training can be initial as well as ongoing, and this should be documented. Now, let us understand what to monitor. For a passive or offsite monitoring, that is a continuing review, we need to monitor many things. Let's begin with the first one. Review all documents which are described in the Standard Operating Procedures SOP. Review the study progress for all ongoing proposals. Review the study completion reports. It is very important to review the serious adverse event reports from all sides. Protocol violation might be very important, and it may call for a detailed monitoring. Protocol violations and deviations are both very crucial and must be covered. Non-compliances which are observed during the study, especially from the monitoring reports of the sponsor, the informed consent documents, the consent documents should be reviewed. If there are chance and if there are availability of audit reports and inspection reports from the regulators, it should be monitored, reviewed. Any communications which comes, for example, a new information or a new research information, then that also should be reviewed. medical management of serious adverse events is extremely important, and the financial compensation that's related to study related injury, how the causality assessment was done, how the compensation was calculated, how the compensation was dispersed should be detailed monitored. It also has a timeline, and that all should be covered under monitoring. For any regulatory clinical trials, it is mandatory to monitor the regulatory compliance. The ethics committee from time to time gives recommendations to the study team. The study team takes corrective actions to them. These corrective actions should also be monitored, if any. The DSMB also gives reports, so if there are any DSMB reports, they also should be monitored. There might be many other points which affects the protection of participants, and that's decided by the EC, and that should be monitored. Now comes the question, what we should look for active monitoring. For active monitoring, when you go for the on-site visit, you should check the log of delegation of responsibilities of all study members, the PI, the COI, the clinical research team members. This is very important, and this is mandatory for regulatory clinical trials. If it is not a regulatory clinical trial, you can still do it. It is one of the best practices. It is very important to check if the site is using the latest EC approved versions, because in a clinical research or a trial, the version keeps changing. The protocol, the informed consent document, which comprises of the participant information sheet and the informed consent form, the CRF, the case record form, the diaries, the advertisements, all have version change. It is very important to stress upon that one need to monitor the ICD, that's informed consent document, especially the informed consent form, to make sure that the site is using the most recent version. One need to observe the consent, informed consent process if it so is deemed necessary or if it's important. That may include AV consent or simple audio consent. This is not always necessary, so if required and if possible. It's a good idea to review randomly selected participant files to ensure that the participants are signing the correct informed consent form. One can also go to the lab and observe the facilities which are necessary for the study at the site. This is required and mandatory for regulatory clinical trials. For other, one can always have as an optional one. It's important to review the project files, because whatever is not documented is not done. So whether the entire documentation is filed appropriately. Source data verification is extremely important in a regulatory clinical trial, and one must review for their completeness and accuracy. It is mandatory for regulatory clinical trials, but it is a good practice for non-regulatory. It is also, if possible, good idea to collect views of study participants and review them. Let us now understand active monitoring or on-site monitoring on the basis of risk-based monitoring. Today, we are in an era of risk-based monitoring. The monitoring can be stressed upon various risks: the low or less than minimal risk or minimal risk, the medium risk and the high risk. For a low risk or less than minimal risk, there may not be any requirement for on-site monitoring. For example, a survey. For a medium risk, risk studies or trials which form the majority of the clinical research study, for example, which involves impartial witness or it involves research implementation, it's necessary to do some random checks to find whether the systems and procedures are in place. It's extremely important for high risks clinical studies like phase 1 clinical trial, where you have vulnerable populations, to have more intensive and more frequent kind of monitoring. Now let us come to 4 cause. We have discussed about the 4 cause monitoring, which calls for a legitimate and specific reasons with a justification. Now these are the 10 justifications which we can think of. There can be more. When there are a high number of protocol deviations and violations, especially violations, protocol violations call for a serious kind of monitoring, because it poses a risk to the right, safety and well-being of the research participants. Large number of studies at a study site, by the same researcher also is a cause of concern. Large number of serious adverse events call for a immediate and prompt action. High recruitment rate also possesses a risk. Participants' grievances calls for an immediate for-cause monitoring. Any adverse media report also demands a for-cause monitoring. There might be adverse information which is received from any other source. That also can be one of the reasons. Non-compliance with the directions or the recommendations given by ethics committees and misconduct by some researcher may cause for for-cause. Apart from this, there might be any other cause as decided by the ethics committee. Now we have understood why, when, where, who, what. It's now very important to know how. This is the most difficult and most important step. Because we will have many monitors or we may have different monitors, we must have some system and procedures in place so that there is an uniformity in action, whether it is done by monitor A or monitor B or monitor C. To solve this problem, we should develop a SOP so that we capture all the elements and do not miss out. The SOP should also be linked with a form, template and checklist, and all this finding should come into a report, so that there is a similarity and uniformity in the findings and actions for taking a corrective measure. Let's begin off how to write a SOP. You will find some suggested readings where you can see an example of many SOPs of such. We can begin by writing the purpose of the SOP, the scope of monitoring. Here you can decide the responsibility. The EC had decided who to be monitored. Slowly you will find that this SOP can mature into an easier form by incorporating a flowchart. It is a very good idea to have a monitoring plan which will specify the strategy, the methods, the responsibilities and most important the requirements of monitoring. Here in the SOP, it will be a good idea to mention the different types of monitoring. The off-site or passive, the on-site or active. The active and on-site, as we mentioned in earlier slides, about the regular and risk-based. Also the for-cause. It is important to define periodicity in the SOP. The periodicity should be kept in mind because monitoring is a time-intensive job. It demands sufficient time, which are protected time. This should be assigned. And still more important to stress upon is we need to demonstrate the periodicity through action. If we have said once in a month, we should really do once in a month. Then we can come to a detailed step, which is step-by-step detailed instructions to write and complete the SOP. This can be based on two areas, selection of how you select an area for monitoring, whether it's passive off-site or active on-site. It's a good idea to define first what you will do and then how will you do. It's absolutely easier if you can define it into three steps: before, which is preparations, during, which is the conduct, and after, which is the follow-up. Since we come across through different terminologies and abbreviations, a glossary will certainly help. The references will help one to study more. It's most important to note that we must have checklist, forms and templates. This will be standardized and this will be used by all monitors. And of course, the last document, the monitoring visit report. Now, if you see the ICMR guideline 2017, they have mentioned that for on-site monitoring, it can be routine or for-cause, and this must be decided at a full committee meeting. If you see the NABH standards of 2016, the NABH have dedicated a standard towards monitoring. It's standard 1.8, which says that the ethics committees follows documented procedures for monitoring and also for for-cause assessment. NABH standard 1.8 has 4 objective elements. It mentions about rights, safety and well-being of the research participants. I prefer to say research participants rather than subjects should be monitored. Adequacy and continuity of consent process shall be ensured. It also mentions how the for-cause assessment should be conducted, which is after of any non-compliances or any complaints that has been received during the conduct of a clinical trial which has been approved by the ethics committee. It mentions a very important point, which is 1.8.4. It talks about continual improvement or Kaizen, where you can find out various opportunities for improvements that shall be identified and their appropriate actions are initiated. It's very important, if you have heard from my first slide to the last, that's cradle to grave, that if it is not documented, it is not done. So you need to continuously document whatever you have done and always ensure and never assume. Now we come to the last section. It says about what do you do for reporting and management of findings. Once the monitoring visit report is prepared by the monitors, they are presented to the full committee by the monitoring team and the member secretary. There is a discussion over them, and the decision of the EC is taken on the basis of either broad consensus or through voting. This is as per the SOP, and the decision is communicated by the SOP through the member secretary to either the PI or sponsor. It's most important to know that there must be a follow-up of the prompt action, and there should be a response from the other end on the recommendations by EC. And this follow-up or recommendation should be again monitored in the next monitoring visit. It is just to know that we should follow something called Plan, Do, Check, Act, PDCA or a quality cycle, so that we know, say what you do what you say, prove it and improve it. While doing this monitoring business, we understand it's extremely challenging for an ethics committee. For every problem, there are some solutions. The biggest challenge is resource, both human and financial. The solution can be a strong institutional support, mainly through funding towards this. Time is the biggest constraint, and committed time and protected time of members should be assigned to make this problem solved. Training is very, very important, and training should be initial and ongoing. Ethics committees are trained in ethics but not in monitoring. They require additional training to empower themselves for monitoring, and this can be solved through an institutional support. I suggest that you read the following 4 areas: the guidelines, the standards, the SOPs. This will help you to understand this better. This monitoring helps us to learn many lessons from the conduct of the entire, from the ethics committee permission given, how the ethics committee is performing, and you can actually see the actions. So you learn a lot of lessons when you conduct a monitoring visits, and it's important, or rather very important, to learn the lessons and improve further, because if we don't learn the lessons at the right time, life will teach us the same lessons at the wrong time, as quoted by Isabel. Thank you for your attention and participation.